When they called her our golden child again at the table in Chicago, I didn't look at Emma. I kept my eyes on the water glass in front of me, the one with the thin crack near the base, and listened to her mother say it the same way she always did, half proud, half performative, like the whole room was supposed to admire what they had all decided Emma was. Our golden child. Someone smiled. Her father nodded once. Her sister gave that tight little laugh people use when they already know their place in the family. The restaurant was one of those polished downtown places where everything reflected light. Wine glasses, silverware, window glass. Even the table looked too clean for real conversation. Outside, Chicago was cold and blue, but inside it was warm, expensive, controlled. That kind of room makes people think they can say anything as long as they say it softly. Emma sat beside me in a cream-colored sweater, composed as ever, chin slightly raised, one hand resting near her drink. She didn't correct them. She never corrected them when they said it. Usually, I let it pass. That night, I didn't. I set my fork down carefully and said, calm enough that it almost sounded casual. She called herself the golden child. I watched it shatter at the table. The words landed harder than I expected. Nobody moved. For a second, the whole table seemed to lose its balance. Her mother blinked at me like she hadn't heard me right. Her father's face stiffened. Someone at the far end let out a nervous laugh that died almost immediately when no one joined in. I still didn't look at Emma. I didn't need to. I could feel the change beside me. Then I turned. She wasn't angry. Not at first. She just stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not as the man who agreed, adapted, smoothed things over, but as someone she had failed to account for. She didn't say a word. And in that silence, with her family frozen around us and the noise of the restaurant carrying on like nothing had happened, I understood something simple. There was no way back after that. Before Chicago, everything about Emma and me looked the way a life is supposed to look when it's moving in the right direction. We lived in Austin in a townhouse that was never fully unpacked because we kept talking about the next place. Something with more space, maybe a yard, maybe a second room that would start as an office and eventually stop pretending to be one. We talked about schools before we talked about neighborhoods. We talked about timing the way people do when they believe the future is a structure already under construction. Emma was easy for other people to admire. She was smart without needing to announce it, polished without seeming vain, disciplined in a way that made other adults feel slightly disorganized around her. She remembered birthdays, sent thank you notes, kept her clothes pressed, her calendar clean, her tone measured. At dinner parties, she was the person people referred to on the drive home. Why can't more people be like Emma? I used to hear that and feel lucky. I worked long hours, kept my head down, handled what was in front of me. I liked routine, invoices, checklists, predictable progress. Emma liked plans, order, visible momentum. From the outside, we made perfect sense. We were the kind of couple people described with words like solid and steady, as if those things were permanent once said out loud enough times. And for a while, I believed that too. Trust has a way of making small things disappear. That was probably the first real mistake I made, though at the time it didn't feel like a mistake at all. It felt like love, or maturity, or whatever word people use when they decide not to be suspicious of the person they share a bed with. If she stayed late at work, I assumed work had run late. If she answered my texts with shorter replies than usual, I assumed she was tired. If she seemed distracted over dinner, or slower to laugh, or quicker to end a conversation with long day, I accepted it because life gives everyone stretches like that. Mine did too. It didn't occur to me to examine hers under brighter light than I used on myself. There were moments, small enough to dismiss, that barely registered when they happened. Her phone face down more often. A little more privacy around ordinary things. A change in perfume she never mentioned. Extra time getting ready for what were supposed to be unremarkable weekday evenings. None of it was enough on its own. None of it looked like the beginning of anything. That's the part people miss when they talk about betrayal. They imagine alarms. They imagine obvious signs, dramatic slips, something that announces itself clearly enough to justify immediate doubt. Most of the time, it doesn't come that way. Most of the time, it arrives looking like stress, like adulthood, like two busy people crossing paths inside a life they still think belongs to both of them. And because everything around us still looked right, I kept explaining it all away. That was easier. It was cleaner. And at the time, I still thought protecting the picture was the same thing as protecting the truth. It didn't start with suspicion. It started with something small enough that I almost ignored it. A receipt. I found it folded once, tucked into the side pocket of her bag while I was looking for a pen. Not hidden, just placed in a way that didn't belong to anything intentional. The kind of thing you only notice because your hand lands on it before your eyes do. Different restaurant. That was the first detail. Not somewhere we went together. Not somewhere she had mentioned. Not even somewhere near her office. It was across town, the kind of place you don't end up in by accident on a weekday evening. I unfolded it, read it once, then again. 2 entrees. 2 drinks. A time that didn't match what she had told me. That was the second detail. She had said she stayed late that night. A delayed meeting. Something routine, something forgettable. I remembered because I had eaten alone and sent her a message asking if she wanted me to save her something. Already ate, she had replied. At the time, I didn't question it. Standing there with the receipt in my hand, I still didn't. I folded it back along the same crease and put it exactly where I found it. Then I finished what I had been doing, closed the bag, and left the room the way it had been when I walked in. I didn't bring it up that night. I didn't ask her about it over dinner. I didn't even look at her differently, at least not in any way she could see. But something had already shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It wasn't even doubt in the way people usually describe it. It was quieter than that. More precise. For the first time, I allowed a single thought to exist without immediately explaining it away. Maybe the truth wasn't what I thought it was. That thought didn't demand anything. It didn't rush me toward confrontation or conclusions. It just stayed there, steady and unwelcome, like a line drawn across something I had previously considered solid. Over the next few days, I noticed things I had already seen before. That was the strange part. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. Nothing new had actually started happening. The patterns were already there. The late evenings. The shorter responses. The small gaps in conversation where details should have been but weren't. The only difference was that I stopped smoothing them out in my own head. I stopped finishing her explanations for her. I stopped replacing inconsistencies with better versions of events that made everything fit again. Instead, I let them remain what they were. Unresolved. And once I did that, they stopped looking small. They started connecting. Not in obvious ways. Not in anything dramatic or undeniable. But enough to create a shape where there hadn't been one before. A pattern. I didn't confront her. I didn't test her with questions or set traps or try to catch her in anything. That would have been too early, and more importantly, it would have been unnecessary. Because once the thought had taken hold, it didn't leave. It followed me through the day, sat with me in traffic, stayed with me at night when the house was quiet, and she was beside me, breathing evenly like nothing had changed. I realized something then that I hadn't understood before. You don't need proof to feel the moment something stops being what you believed it was. Proof just comes later. And by the time it does, the shift has already happened. That night, I said nothing. We went through the same routine we always did. Dinner was quiet, but not unusual. She talked about work in broad strokes. Nothing specific enough to verify, nothing vague enough to question. I nodded in the right places, asked the same measured follow-ups I always had. From the outside, it would have looked like any other evening between two people who had settled into a rhythm. But I wasn't inside that rhythm anymore. I was observing it. When we went to bed, she fell asleep quickly. She always did. One arm tucked under the pillow, breathing steady, face turned slightly away from me. There was a time when I used to watch her like that and feel something close to certainty. Like whatever happened outside the house, this part was fixed. That night, I stared into the dark and felt something else. I didn't replay the receipt over and over. I didn't build scenarios or imagine conversations that hadn't happened. I didn't even try to guess who she might have been with. I just stopped doing something I had always done without realizing it. I stopped explaining her. That was the break. It didn't feel dramatic. There was no surge of anger, no sudden clarity that made everything obvious. It was quieter than that, more controlled. I removed the assumption that she was telling me the truth. And once that assumption was gone, everything around it shifted. Her words no longer carried the same weight. Her routines no longer felt automatic. Even silence started to register differently, not as comfort, but as absence of information. I turned my head slightly and looked at her in the dark. For the first time, I didn't see her as the person I knew. I saw her as someone whose actions I hadn't verified. Someone whose version of events existed without confirmation. That distance wasn't emotional at first. It was structural, like stepping back from a building you've lived in long enough to notice the cracks in the foundation. I didn't confront her. There was nothing to confront yet, not in a way that would hold up to anything beyond a feeling. And I wasn't interested in feelings anymore, not without something to support them. So I stayed still, listened to the room, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the occasional sound of a car passing outside, the steady rhythm of her breathing. And I made a decision that didn't need to be spoken out loud. From that point on, I wasn't going to react to what she said. I was going to pay attention to what was real, not the version of events she offered, not the explanations that came easily, just the facts as they existed, independent of either of us. I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't try to predict it. I just understood that something had shifted permanently. I wasn't the person who believed without checking anymore. And once that changes, it doesn't change back. I started paying attention, not in a dramatic way. Nothing that would change how the days looked from the outside. I didn't follow her. I didn't check her phone when she wasn't looking. I didn't ask questions designed to trap her into contradictions. I just stopped ignoring what was already there. Patterns don't appear all at once. They build in fragments, small enough to dismiss individually, but consistent enough to matter when you stop dismissing them. Her phone was the first thing I noticed clearly. Not the fact that she used it, everyone does, but how she used it. Messages that would appear and then disappear. Notifications that showed for a second and then were gone before I could read them, even when I was sitting right beside her. She started keeping it closer, turning it slightly away without making it obvious. It wasn't secrecy in the obvious sense. It was control. Then came the calls. She would step into the other room more often. Not every time. Just enough to create a difference from before. Her tone would lower slightly. Her responses shorter, more contained. When she came back, there was always a transition, a small pause before she re-entered whatever conversation we had been having. I didn't interrupt any of it. I just noted it. The name came later. Ryan. It showed up once, briefly, in a notification before it disappeared. No last name. No context. Just a first name attached to a message that I didn't get to read. That was enough. I didn't react. I didn't ask who Ryan was. I didn't search for him or try to force the information into the open. I waited. A few days later, I saw it again. Same name. Same pattern. A message that existed just long enough to confirm it wasn't random. After that, things started connecting faster. There was an app one didn't recognize. It wasn't on her main screen. I only saw it because she opened it quickly, thinking I wasn't looking, then closed it just as fast. No notification history. No visible threads. Just a blank interface when she wasn't actively using it. Hidden, but not well enough. And once I knew to look for it, I saw it more than once. I didn't need access to it. I didn't need to read a single message. Because by then, the structure was already there. The timing of her late nights. The gaps in her explanations. The presence of a name that didn't belong to our life. The existence of a second channel of communication that had no place in anything transparent. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it together. The timeline took longer. That part didn't come from a single moment. It assembled slowly, through repetition, through consistency. The same days. The same windows of time. The same patterns repeating often enough that they stopped being coincidence. 2 years. Not confirmed in a single piece of evidence, but built from everything that aligned too cleanly to be anything else. I didn't confront her. There was nothing to gain from that yet. Instead, I let the facts settle into place without interference. I didn't rush them. I didn't try to force a conclusion before everything had aligned on its own. Because the truth, when it's consistent, doesn't need pressure. It holds. And once it holds, it doesn't need to be argued. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was observing something that existed whether I acknowledged it or not. And that made it simple. Not easy, but simple. At some point, it stopped being just about us. Up until then, everything I had seen could still be contained inside the idea of a private failure. A relationship that had shifted, quietly, without announcement. Something that could, in theory, be addressed between two people without involving anything beyond the walls of our own life. But that wasn't the reality anymore. Because our life wasn't just ours. We had plans that extended beyond the present. Conversations that had been repeated enough times to feel like commitments. Children we hadn't had yet, but had already discussed, as if they were part of a schedule waiting to be executed at the right time. There were timelines. There were expectations. There were people who believed in a version of us that no longer existed. Her family, especially, had already placed her in a role that didn't allow for deviation. The golden child wasn't just a nickname. It was a position, one she maintained carefully, consistently, across every interaction. I had watched it for years. The way she adjusted her tone depending on who she was speaking to. The way she presented information, never inaccurate, but never complete. The way she avoided anything that might disrupt the image that had been built around her. To them, she hadn't changed. She was still composed, still reliable, still the example everyone pointed to when they wanted to illustrate what stability looked like. And in every gathering, every conversation, every shared moment, I started to notice the distance between that version of her and the one I had been observing. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. She could move between those versions without hesitation. Sit at a table, smile, contribute, respond exactly as expected. There was no visible strain. No hesitation that would suggest anything beneath the surface was misaligned. If I hadn't known what I knew, I wouldn't have seen it either. That was the part that settled in the most. Not the betrayal itself, but the consistency. The ability to maintain two parallel realities without one interfering with the other. In one, she was everything they believed her to be. In the other, she was someone they would not recognize. And I was the only one standing between those two versions, aware that both existed at the same time. I didn't expose it. I didn't hint at it. I didn't try to disrupt the structure she had built. Because by then, I understood something that made action unnecessary. The truth doesn't need to be forced into the open when it's already active. It just needs the right moment. And until that moment arrived, there was no advantage in moving early. So I stayed where I was, present in every conversation, participating when expected, saying what needed to be said and nothing more. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, everything had already separated. What we had was no longer shared. It was divided. And I had stopped trying to reconcile the two sides into something that made sense. I just let them exist. And waited. I didn't bring it up at home. There's a kind of confrontation that feels immediate, almost automatic. You find something, you react, you demand answers while the emotion is still close enough to justify it. I understood that impulse, but I had already moved past it. Whatever this was, it had been happening long before I became aware of it. There was no urgency left. So I waited. Not for a perfect moment, just for one that couldn't be redirected, softened, or dismissed as misunderstanding. A setting where silence would carry more weight than explanation. Chicago gave me that. The table, the family, the structure she relied on. It all worked in a way that didn't require me to raise my voice or escalate anything beyond a single question. After I said what I said, after the room settled into that strained quiet, I turned slightly toward her. Not fully. Just enough. Were you or were you not with Ryan for 2 years? I asked it the same way I would ask for confirmation on a detail that already had an answer. No accusation. No emphasis. Just a direct line that didn't leave space for interpretation. The name landed differently there than it would have at home. Out in the open, it had weight. Her reaction wasn't immediate. She didn't deny it. She didn't correct me. She didn't even try to reframe the question into something safer. She just stayed still. And in that stillness, everything aligned. People expect confession to come in words. Something clear, something verbal that closes the gap between suspicion and certainty. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes the absence of a response is the only confirmation you need. Her mother shifted in her seat, confused but quiet. Her father looked between us, trying to understand what he had just heard without asking directly. Someone reached for a glass, then stopped halfway, as if unsure whether movement itself would make things worse. Emma kept her eyes on me for a moment longer. Then she looked away. That was it. No explanation. No attempt to recover control. Just silence. And that silence did what no argument could have done. It removed any remaining space for doubt. I didn't follow up. There was nothing left to ask. The question had already done its job. Not by forcing an answer, but by placing the truth in a position where avoiding it became visible. I leaned back slightly, picked up my glass, and took a small sip of water. The room didn't recover. Conversations didn't resume the way they normally do after an awkward moment. No one tried to redirect. No one made a joke to ease the tension. Because everyone understood, even without full context, that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone within that setting. Emma didn't speak for the rest of the meal. Neither did I. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been established, not through what was said, but through what wasn't. After that, I didn't need to do anything. That was the part one understood clearly as we left the restaurant. There was no strategy left to execute, no confrontation to escalate, no explanation to demand. The structure she had maintained for years had already started to separate on its own, not loudly, but visibly. We walked out into the cold without speaking. Her parents stayed behind a few seconds longer than necessary, as if giving us space would somehow contain what had already been said. It didn't. Nothing about that moment could be contained anymore. Outside, the air was sharp enough to make breathing feel deliberate. Emma stood beside me, her posture still composed, but there was a delay in everything now. The way she adjusted her coat, the way she looked at her phone without unlocking it. Small hesitations that hadn't existed before. "You shouldn't have done that there," she said finally. Her voice was controlled, measured, the same tone she used in every situation where she believed control was still possible. I looked straight ahead. "There wasn't anywhere else left to do it," I said. She didn't respond, because she understood what I meant. This wasn't something that could go back behind closed doors. Not after being placed in front of people who had only ever seen one version of her. And once that contrast existed, it couldn't be removed. The next few days moved faster than I expected. Not in direct conversations with me. Those stayed minimal, functional, almost procedural. But around us, things started shifting. Messages that used to come casually stopped. Group conversations slowed down. Invitations became more cautious. It wasn't immediate exposure. No one called me directly to ask for details. No one confronted her outright. But the tone changed. People noticed. Not the full story. Just enough. That's how these things move. Not through announcements, but through adjustments. A look held a second longer. A question that wasn't asked. A conversation that ended earlier than it should have. I didn't explain anything to anyone. I didn't confirm or deny what they might have assumed. There was no need. Because the absence of correction allowed the truth to settle where it naturally would. Emma tried, in small ways, to stabilize things. More messages, more presence, more effort to appear unchanged. But consistency works both ways. Once it breaks, trying to recreate it too quickly only makes the shift more obvious. I stepped back from all of it. Not physically at first, just in involvement. I stopped engaging in conversations that required energy I no longer had for this. Stopped participating in the version of our life that depended on mutual agreement to function. I handled what needed to be handled. Work, logistics, practical details. Everything else, I left alone. Because by then, I understood something that made effort unnecessary. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to convince anyone. The situation was already moving toward its own conclusion. All I had to do was not interfere with it. And when you stop interfering, things tend to resolve exactly the way they're built to. Quietly and completely. I didn't feel like I had won. That thought came later, after things had already settled into what they were going to be. Not in a single moment. Not tied to any specific conversation or event. Just gradually, as the noise around everything started to fade. Because there is a version of this where it feels like a victory. Where exposing something, letting it collapse in front of the right people, creates a sense of resolution that looks like control. Like you forced the truth into the open and watched it take effect. That wasn't what this was. By the time everything reached its end, there wasn't anything left to win. Emma moved through the final weeks the same way she moved through everything else. Controlled, measured, focused on maintaining what could still be maintained. Conversations between us stayed minimal. Direct when necessary, absent when not. There were no long discussions. No attempts to repair anything. No arguments about what had happened. Because none of that would have changed the structure that had already broken. We handled the practical parts. Separate accounts. Shared responsibilities divided cleanly. Decisions made without emotion, just function. It felt less like ending something and more like closing out a process that had already completed itself. There were moments where silence stretched longer than usual. Not uncomfortable, just empty. The kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled because there's nothing left worth saying inside it. I didn't ask her why. That question had no value anymore. The reasons, whatever they were wouldn't alter the outcome. They wouldn't change the timeline, wouldn't shift the decisions that had already been made over the span of 2 years without my knowledge. Understanding it wouldn't restore anything. So I left it alone. People around us adjusted. Some stayed distant. Some tried to remain neutral. A few reached out carefully, without asking direct questions, offering support in a way that didn't require me to explain anything. I accepted it the same way I handled everything else at that point. Calmly, without expanding on it. Because the situation didn't need a narrative anymore. It had already resolved itself. The version of her that existed in other people's minds didn't disappear overnight. It just lost its certainty. And once certainty is gone, it doesn't come back in the same form. I moved out without conflict. No scene. No final conversation that tried to summarize everything. Just a shift from one place to another, handled the same way I approached every other step. Direct. Efficient. Final. I didn't carry anything with me that didn't serve a purpose. Not physically. Not otherwise. And when it was done, when there were no more shared details to manage, no more overlap to navigate, I realized something simple. I hadn't lost anything that was still real. And I hadn't gained anything either. I had just reached the point where what existed and what I believed existed were no longer the same. And once those two things separate, there's only one direction left to move. Forward. Life didn't stop. That was the first thing I noticed after everything was finished. Not immediately, not in some dramatic realization. Just in the way days continued to move forward without asking whether I was ready for them or not. Work stayed the same. Morning routines stayed the same. The city didn't shift to match what had happened. Traffic still built at the same hours. Coffee still tasted the same. Conversations at work still followed the same patterns they always had. Nothing around me changed. Just my perspective inside it. I didn't think about Emma the way I used to. Not with anger. Not with regret. Just with clarity. She became a fixed point in the past, something that had been understood incorrectly for a long time and then corrected all at once. That correction didn't feel dramatic. It felt precise. The biggest change wasn't in how I saw her. It was in how I saw everything else. I stopped assuming consistency meant honesty. Stopped believing that what people present is automatically aligned with what they are. Not in a cynical way, just in a measured one. I pay attention now. To details. To patterns. To what repeats over time. Because that's where the truth usually is. Not in what's said, but in what holds steady when no one thinks you're watching. And once you learn to see that, you don't really go back to the way you looked at things before. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.